Imagine opening up um, a beautifully illustrated, beloved children's book. You know the kind I'm talking about, right? Bright colors, maybe some whimsical characters.
Yeah, like some talking animals wandering through a magical forest or something.
Exactly. It feels perfectly safe, just, pure, unadulterated escapism for you. But then imagine you take that very same book, you hold it up to a black light, and suddenly you see these hidden, almost sinister warnings.
Right, like scrawled in invisible ink across the pages. It completely shatters the illusion.
It really does.
Suddenly the whimsy isn't just, whimsy anymore. It's this very thin veil draped over something much heavier.
Hmm.
I mean, we tend to think of our pop culture and fairy tales as these pristine, isolated creations.
But they just exist in a vacuum.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But they are almost always anchored in the messy, often grim realities of their time.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. We are opening up a massive stack of sources for this deep dive. We've got historical medical journals, etymology dictionaries from the 18th century, and some pretty heavy-hitting literary analyses.
It's a great stack today.
It is, and we have a very specific mission. We are going to unpack the fascinating, tragically realistic, and honestly, slightly disturbing history behind a phrase I guarantee you have heard a million times. The phrase is mad as a hatter.
Which is a phrase we throw around so casually today, right? Just to describe someone acting a bit eccentric or wacky.
Yeah, like an oddball neighbor or something.
Right. But the source material we're looking at takes us far past the whimsy of any fairy tale. It plunges us straight into the really gritty, toxic realities of 18th and 19th century industrial life.
But to get to the bottom of this one, we actually have to start by dismantling what is probably your very first assumption about where this phrase even comes from. We have to go down the rabbit hole.
But perhaps the wrong rabbit hole.
Right, the wrong rabbit hole. Let's talk about the 1865 publication of Lewis Carroll's absolute masterpiece, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I mean, it is impossible to overstate how much of a cultural juggernaut this book is.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the most enduring, recognizable creations from that 1865 novel is, without a doubt, the Mad Hatter.
The icon himself.
Yeah, I mean, Carroll paints this incredibly vivid picture of a character who is hosting this perpetually chaotic, never-ending tea party with the March Hare and the Dormouse.
And the Hatter's behavior in the book is so specifically bizarre. He isn't just loud or energetic, He recites completely incomprehensible poetry.
Right, they bat poetry.
Yes. And he asks Alice these meaningless riddles that inherently have no answers, like the really famous one, why is a raven like a writing desk?
Which is just maddening.
Completely maddening. He's abrasive, he's disorganized, he's mad.
He is. We also have to acknowledge how that specific image of the character was catapulted into the stratosphere of popular culture decades later.
Mm-hmm.
Like the original novel laid the groundwork, sure, but adaptations really cemented it.
The Disney one.
Specifically, Disney's 1951 animated classic. That film took Carroll's chaotic character and gave him a bright green hat, a beaming voice, and an indelible place in the minds of multiple generations.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because despite everything we just laid out, despite the 1865 novel, the Tea Party, despite the Disney movie and the endless Halloween costumes you see every year, the exact phrase, mad as a hatter, does not appear anywhere in Lewis Carroll's books.
Not once. It is completely absent from the text.
When I was going through the literary analyses for this deep dive, that fact literally stopped me in my tracks. It is a complete cultural Mandela effect.
It really is.
We have collectively hallucinated that Lewis Carroll invented this phrase.
What's fascinating here is just how overwhelmingly powerful popular culture can be when it comes to shaping our collective memory.
Yeah, it just overwrites things.
Exactly. A highly successful adaptation, like the 1951 animated movie, combined with the sheer longevity of Carroll's characters, essentially overwrote the true origins of the phrase in the public consciousness.
So society retroactively assigned the invention of the idiom to the piece of media that popularized the aesthetic.
Right, rather than looking at where the idiom actually came from.
Wow. So we essentially gave Lewis Carroll credit for a colloquialism he just borrowed. Which means, if he didn't invent the phrase in 1865, the timeline demands that we look backward. The phrase had to exist before Alice ever tumbled down that rabbit hole.
And our sources point us far away from the literary myth and directly into historical occupational reality.
Huh.
If you want to find the first documented appearance of the phrase mad as a hatter, you actually have to go back to the year 1829.
1829, that is more than 3.5 decades before Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was even published.
Exactly. It appears in an issue of a literary journal called Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine. And the context there isn't about magical tea parties at all. It points us toward the booming hat-making trade of the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in England.
Okay, so we are pivoting from a colorful storybook to the soot-stained streets of industrial England.
A very different vibe.
Very different. And the hat-making business was massive back then. Like, a hat wasn't just a fun accessory for the elite, right? It was a mandatory societal staple across all classes.
You didn't leave the house without one.
Right. And the absolute premium material for making these hats, the core ingredient, was felt. So why felt specifically?
Well, felt is incredibly durable. It's water resistant, and it holds its shape exceptionally well, which is perfect for structured hats like the top hats that were completely dominating Victorian fashion at the time.
Okay, makes sense.
But creating felt out of animal fur, typically rabbit or beaver fur, is not a simple process. Animal fur naturally has these microscopic barbs on the fibers.
Like little hooks.
Yeah, little hooks.
Yeah.
And to make high-quality felt, you have to break down the keratin in the fur, so those barbs shrunk, twist, and lock together into a really dense matted fabric.
And doing that efficiently, like on a massive industrial scale, required a very specific chemical process. The sources we read refer to it as kerating.
Yeah, kerating. The term actually comes from the visual result of the process. The hat makers used a chemical solution to break down the keratin, and this solution would turn the edges of the white fur a distinct, rusty, carrot orange color.
Which sounds harmless enough, right? Kerating. But the chemical they were using to achieve this orange matted fur is where the story goes from a quirky historical footnote to an absolute tragedy.
It really does.
Because the primary active ingredient in that solution was mercury nitrate.
Liquid mercury mixed with nitric acid.
Which is just, I mean, they were essentially using tubs of heavy metal neurotoxins. Walk me through what this actually looked like for a worker on the floor.
Well, picture a poorly ventilated, damp, dark workshop in 19th century England. These workers, these hatters, are standing over vats of steaming water mixed with this mercury nitrate solution.
Just breathing it in?
Constantly. They're plunging the fur into the boiling liquid, agitating it, pulling it out, and the heat causes the mercury to vaporize. So day in and day out, these craftsmen are breathing in concentrated mercury vapor.
That's awful.
It's in their lungs, it's settling on their skin. They're likely ingesting it when they eat their lunches right there in the workshop.
And we know today what the industry simply ignored then, which is that long-term exposure to heavy metals is devastatingly toxic to the human body. How exactly does mercury break down a person?
Mercury is incredibly insidious because it crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Oh.
Yeah. When inhaled as a vapor, it enters the bloodstream through the lungs and travels directly to the central nervous system. Once there, it binds to proteins and enzymes, literally destroying neurons and short-circuiting the brain's ability to communicate with the body.
The sources called this condition erethism, right?
Yes. Clinically, it's known as erethism.
And the sources detail a terrifying cascade of physiological breakdowns. This wasn't just like a mild illness.
Not at all. It usually started with minor tremors in the hands, which became known colloquially as hatter's shakes.
Just the fact that it had an occupational nickname tells you how widespread it was.
It was an epidemic within the trade. A worker would drop a tool or struggle to hold a teacup without spilling it.
A teacup. Wow, the irony there is so dark.
It really is. But the symptoms progressed rapidly from there. Workers experienced profound loss of vision and hearing. Their teeth would literally loosen and fall out due to severe gum inflammation.
God.
And they suffered from a complete lack of physical coordination, stumbling around as if they were intoxicated.
But it wasn't just physical, right? Because the psychological symptoms in the medical journals are even more disturbing.
Much more disturbing, yeah.
They noted severe impairments of speech. The workers would slur their words or speak in these jagged, incomprehensible rhythms. And the psychological hallmark of erethism was extreme social anxiety, paranoia, and sudden severe mood swings.
Right. A worker might be deeply melancholic one minute and completely irate the next.
Yeah. Think about the fast fashion you wear today, for you listening to this deep dive. The hats of the 1800s were their version of fast fashion, a booming essential industry that was affordable for the consumer, but incredibly costly for the worker.
Very costly.
It makes me think of modern historical discoveries, where we suddenly realize an industry is built on a foundation of poison. Like when we look back at the radium girls in the 1920s painting watch dials with radioactive paint.
Or when we realized asbestos was just destroying people's lungs in construction.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely recontextualizes the word mad. The madness that the 1829 magazine referenced wasn't a quirky personality trait.
It wasn't just them being goofy.
No, it wasn't a fun, eccentric choice. It was a tragic physiological breakdown of seasoned craftsmen who were simply trying to earn a living. They weren't mad in the sense of being wildly imaginative. Their brains were deteriorating due to heavy metal toxicity.
And Victorian society largely looked the other way.
They did, because these were working-class tradesmen, and the economic engine of the fashion industry was simply too profitable to slow down.
That is just gut-wrenching. You look at the Mad Hatter character, spouting incomprehensible poetry, suffering from severe mood swings, acting totally uncoordinated, and suddenly you realize that is a direct mirror of a dying man's neurological symptoms.
It is a dark reflection of industrial-era suffering, heavily sanitized for a children's book.
But wait, if the industrial poisoning was just peaking in the 1820s and 30s, did society really coin this idiom overnight? Like, did they just invent it on the spot? Or was the word mad or hatter already floating around in the language waiting to be used?
That's a great point because
the etymology dictionaries in our stack of sources point to a completely different angle that goes back even further.
Right. The linguistic roots of the phrase might actually predate the industrial tragedy, or at least run parallel to it in a very unexpected way.
Okay, let's talk about Samuel Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1755. This is a monumental work, like one of the most influential dictionaries in the history of the English language.
Absolutely foundational.
And when you look up the word hatter in Johnson's 1755 dictionary, it is not listed as a noun. It doesn't mean a person who makes hats.
No, Johnson actually lists hatter as a verb. And the definition he provides for to hatter is to harass or to harangue.
To harass or harangue, meaning this combative, unstable, aggressive energy. Like if someone was badgering you relentlessly, you might say they were hattering you.
Yes. Language in the 18th century was highly fluid, and lexicographers like Johnson were often just recording colloquial street usage. So hattering was an action of wearing someone down.
But the historical linguistics go even deeper than that. There is a prominent theory in our sources linking the phrase to the Old English word adder, A-T-T-E-R. And what does adder literally translate to? It translates to poison.
Poison. Just incredible.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have an Old English word, adder, meaning poison. We have a 1755 dictionary defining hatter as a verb for harassing unstable energy. And then we have a 19th century industry where hat makers are literally being poisoned by mercury, causing unstable, erratic behavior.
It all converges.
Yeah. Is this just a massive historical coincidence?
This raises an important question about how language evolves and attaches itself to reality. Words rarely develop in a vacuum, you know. It is entirely plausible that the verb hatter, meaning to harass with unstable energy, existed in the linguistic background for centuries.
Just floating around.
Right. And similarly, the root word for poison was lingering in the dialects. But as the hat-making industry grew, and people began to notice that actual hat makers, noun hatters, were developing this exact kind of erratic, unstable behavior due to mercury.
The linguistic concept and the physical reality just locked together.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates how communities process occupational hazards. When you see your neighbors and coworkers succumbing to this strange, terrifying affliction, society naturally reaches for the language it already has to make sense of it.
So the phrase mad as a hatter becomes a shorthand.
Yes, a culturally understood touchstone for this very specific type of suffering. The word perfectly described the tragic victims, and the victims perfectly embodied the word.
Okay, so we've established that the phrase is decades, if not centuries, older than Alice's adventures in Wonderland.
Definitely.
We understand the chemical mechanics of the devastating mercury poisoning in the felt industry. We've traced the dictionary definitions of harassment and poison. But that brings us right back to our original problem. It brings us back to Lewis Carroll.
The author who popularized it all for us today.
Right. If the phrase already existed as this tragic, heavy colloquialism about poisoned craftsmen, how did Carroll come up with his highly specific, visually unforgettable character? Like, Why the Tea Party? Why the riddles? Where did the actual physical avatar of the Mad Hatter come from, if not a hat factory?
To answer that, the literary sources introduce us to a real-life contemporary of Carroll's, a man named Theophilus Carter.
Theophilus Carter.
Carter lived in Oxford at the exact same time Lewis Carroll was living and working there at Christ Church College. But here is the crucial detail. Theophilus Carter was not a hat maker.
Wait, really?
He had absolutely nothing to do with the felt or mercury industries. He was actually a cabinet maker.
Hold on, a cabinet maker. If the entire phrase is rooted in the tragedy of poisoned hat makers, why on earth would Carroll use a furniture maker as his model? Doesn't that defeat the entire point of the idiom?
Well, you have to remember, Carroll wasn't writing a documentary about industrial labor practices. No. He was writing a surrealist fantasy.
Okay.
He already knew the phrase mad as a hatter because it was a common Victorian idiom by then. But he needed a visual avatar to anchor that phrase to the page. He needed a personality. And Theophilus Carter was a very well-known local eccentric in Oxford.
What kind of eccentric are we talking about?
The sources describe how Carter would frequently take up a position standing outside his furniture shop right on Oxford's High Street, regardless of the weather.
Just standing out there.
Yeah, he was a fixture of the local scenery, known for his flamboyant personality, his loud, booming voice, and his highly specific, unusual behaviors, like always wearing a top hat pushed to the back of his head while loudly debating passersby.
Ah, so he was a local character. Every town has one. And Carroll, living in Oxford, walking those streets every day, would have absolutely known who Theophilus Carter was.
Almost certainly. Carroll was a really keen observer of the world around him. He was constantly absorbing the personalities, the speech patterns, and the eccentricities of the people in his orbit.
So, let me get this straight. Carroll takes the phrase, which he already knows, but he completely strips away the grim reality of the heavy metal poisoning.
Right.
He replaces the tragedy with tea and riddles, keeps the erratic energy, and just slaps the face of a local Oxford furniture maker onto the character.
It is exactly the synthesis. He takes the visual eccentricity and the vibrant, harmless oddity of a local figure, and he maps it onto the deeply ingrained, tragic cultural trope of the neurologically impaired hat maker.
Wow.
The blend of a poisoned industry and a local Oxford cabinet maker is what creates the literary icon we know today.
It is a masterpiece of character creation, even if it, completely washed away the original meaning of the phrase for a century and a half.
It really shows how fiction can act as a kind of alchemy, taking the base, sometimes awful realities of the world and spinning them into something whimsical.
But at a cost.
Definitely at a cost, because in doing so, it often erases the memory of the real people whose suffering birthed the idiom in the first place.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive? We've gone from the vibrant colors of a Disney tea party to the toxic, mercury-filled workshops of industrial England.
It's been a ride.
We've waded through the microscopic breakdown of rabbit fur, back through the dusty pages of an 18th century dictionary, and finally to a quirky cabinet maker standing on an Oxford street corner.
It is a massive journey just to uncover a single phrase.
And the takeaway is this. The next time you hear someone described as being mad as a hatter, maybe they're acting a little chaotic or they've asked a bizarre question, I want you to think past the top hat and the teacups.
Right.
Remember the 19th century craftsmen.
Yeah.
Remember the people whose livelihoods slowly, chemically cost them their minds, giving this phrase its sad, deeply tragic historical weight.
It completely changes how you view a simple turn of phrase, doesn't it?
Really does.
And it leaves you with a thought to mull over long after we wrap up here. Since we've proven today that one of the most whimsical characters in all of literature was actually born from a cocktail of industrial poisoning and local street eccentricities, what other lighthearted fairy tales or everyday idioms are we blindly repeating today that are actually masking dark, forgotten historical tragedies?
The next time you open a children's book, you might just find yourself looking for that invisible ink.